I am the clinical director of Maia Rehab, and we every month we organise a relevant and interesting training session for information sharing. The purpose of this is to provide our own teams, our own rehab assistants, some interesting and relevant training for their work with the clients they work with. And then one day we thought, well, why are we keeping this to ourselves? Let's share it across the board to everyone else. We're not looking to charge for any of it. We just think it's such an important part. As Paul, you might have just caught Paul saying this. It's such an important part of what every one of us does, regardless of what our role is, working with the clients that we work with. So any of these sessions that we provide is going to be relevant and interesting. So please do join us in future as well. As I said, the purpose is that we like to offer this to our rehab assistants, and we provide rehab assistance to other case managers, other teams, and we make sure that they are trained, experienced, and happy and raring to go. So please do let us know if you also would like some information on the rehab assistance that we have. Today is a very interesting one again. This one is post-traumatic stress disorder following traumatic brain injury. And I'm not going to even attempt to tell you anything about that, because I'm going to leave it to the expert on this, and that is Dr. Paul Priem, who we work very closely with on a consultancy level. When we work with the clients that we at Maia have, if ever we're not sure, then he is the person that we will contact. So let me hand over to Paul. There will be an opportunity at the end to ask him any questions that are needed from you, and please hang around afterwards if you want to know any more. But over to Paul.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. You will notice immediately from the title, post-traumatic stress disorder following traumatic brain injury. And then I've put in brackets there a question mark. That's not a mistake. This is actually quite a contentious area of thinking in neuropsychology. And the reasons for that will become clear as we proceed. For many years, particularly through the 90s, when I was growing up as a psychologist and doing research, particularly around diagnosis, not of PTSD, of other things, but around the validity of diagnostic categories and how we make diagnoses, I became aware of what a movable feast those things are and how they change over time, depending on our thinking and the research that follows that thinking. And for many years, post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury were thought to be virtually impossible to coincide. And so the rates of diagnosis or comorbid diagnosis of those two conditions was actually pretty rare. And like I say, I think the reasons for that will become obvious as we go forward. So first of all, post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm aware there's a lot of small print on this slide, but it was really the only way of actually putting it all in one place and keeping the number of slides I have to a manageable amount. What I've put here is actually the diagnostic criteria. It's a summary of the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. So to achieve a diagnosis of PTSD, these are the kinds of things that have to be present, and they have to hang together. So it's not the case that you can simply have one or the other of these things. In this summary, you need to have the bulk of all of these things in one form or another. I'll whip through them quite quickly. It's going to develop after exposure to a traumatic event. And of course, many things can be traumatic. Doesn't have to be road traffic accidents. It can be hospital operations. It can be interpersonal violence, military action, of course, or disasters, or natural disasters that often many people are involved in. But the types of trauma are very broad. But there's little doubt around what trauma is. We know it when we see it. We know what a traumatic incident is. Intrusions. So the person, after witnessing a traumatic event, they will experience intrusions, and those intrusions are into the mind and into the feelings of the individual, and they could be flashbacks, they could be images that pop into the head of that traumatic incident. They can be sensory impressions, smells, tactile sensations. It can occur in dreams and nightmares. People will dream about the events, and they will experience very strong emotion with those intrusions. So they will experience fear, as if they were back in that time, re-experiencing that event. And those intrusions can be pretty horrible. As a consequence, people will try to avoid anything which triggers those intrusions. So they will avoid people they might have known at the time or who were also involved. They certainly don't want to have conversations about it. They will try to avoid any kind of trigger that might provoke those intrusions to occur. Some of those circumstances and triggers are very difficult to avoid. Loud bangs are actually very frequent. Cars backfiring, doors slamming. Loud bangs are actually a pretty frequent thing. We probably don't notice them most of the time that they happen. We just filter them out as kind of innocuous events. But to someone who's experienced a traumatic event, may have post-traumatic stress disorder, even a loud bang can actually be enough to provoke a flashback and those intrusive cognitions. There will be negative alterations in mood and cognition as a consequence of the repeated experience of the intrusions and the avoidance of them. So people will feel alienated. Their affect, their emotional range can be restricted, flattened affect. They will have diminished interest in significant activities, and it can reach right into functional aspects of life. So it can become agoraphobic, people not wanting to leave the house because they feel unsafe, or they don't know how they're going to cope if they have a flashback while they're out. So it can reach into everything. People, of course, who develop PTSD after a road traffic accident, for example, may find it very difficult being either a passenger or a driver of a vehicle, and that can be a very limiting factor on people's lives. They can also have difficulty remembering key features of the traumatic incident, and that's part of that avoidance, that internal avoidance of memories, because it's so distressing that they will actually blank those things out and be unable to remember them. And that avoidance and the intrusions, they have a very interdependent relationship. These memories, these feelings, they're demanding to be processed. They're demanding attention and time inside the person. Of course, the person is then trying to avoid them because they're so distressing and upsetting. And the more they avoid, the more the intrusions happen. And so we tend to have this interdependent tug of war going on between avoidance and intrusion. There are alterations in arousal or reactivity. So people will become very hypervigilant for threat. The avoidance of getting in a car, after a traffic accident, the avoidance of going near a doctor after receiving a difficult diagnosis. They will be easily startled. Again, that's the loud bang example that we were talking about a moment ago. That heightened arousal, that's very chemical, very, very physical, and it's pretty pervasive. People are on guard all of the time. They're adrenalized all of the time. So they're going to have sleep problems because they can't relax. They're going to be very, very restless, jumpy. They're going to be extremely irritable and very snappy. And of course, that will start to affect people's relationships, both the individual's enjoyment of them, but also the family, the people around them, are going to find that irritability a bit difficult to deal with. And those functional symptoms have to be there. Those effects on function have to be there. We can be distressed, and distress, high levels of personal distress, is one of the diagnostic features. People have to be distressed, in a very pervasive way about the traumatic incident. But distress alone is rarely sufficient for diagnosis. In some cases it is sufficient, but distress alone, I would be looking for there to be some form of functional impact. Things that people are avoiding doing, which is having a broader impact on their life and their relationships. And very, very importantly, the last point on this slide is that diagnosis should not be made if symptoms are better accounted for by another health condition. And I think we have to keep that in mind as we move on to have a look at the frequent neuropsychological effects of traumatic brain injury. People who have had a traumatic brain injury, of course, have been involved in a traumatic incident by definition, whether that's a fall, an assault, road traffic accident as pedestrian or passenger or vehicle user. There has been a traumatic incident, but it's not necessarily immediately obvious that they will suffer post-traumatic stress disorder. We can experience trauma and not develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Estimates are, the rule of thumb is that about 1/3 of people who experience a traumatic incident will go on to develop a PTSD, a post-traumatic stress disorder. And of those people, quite interestingly again, about 2/3 of them are women and 1/3 men. And all of these things we are still trying to understand as to why only 1/3 develop PTSD, why more women than men. It's not automatic. And this is the case with traumatic brain injury also. There's definitely been a traumatic incident, and with a brain injury, there will be all of these effects, or very, very frequently, there will be these effects, particularly with moderate to severe, but also with mild traumatic brain injury also. So there will be, and this is a very, very key one, post-traumatic amnesia due to prolonged periods of reduced consciousness. So people who have suffered a moderate to severe traumatic brain injury, they've had a big, big physical knock to the head and neck and likely the rest of their body as well. They've been made unconscious by that traumatic event. So they might see the vehicle approach them. They might remember someone swinging a weapon. They might remember slipping from the ladder. After that, it's unconsciousness. That amnesia can extend to way before the traumatic incident, and it can extend way after the traumatic incident. So there's a loss of memory for the trauma itself. people can have reduced or challenged abilities to participate in functional and previously enjoyed activities. So and this is a natural consequence of moderate to severe brain injury. People are anxious when they have a brain injury, when they're recovering from a brain injury. They're very anxious about their ability to perform in a whole variety of circumstances, right from coordinating the needs of running a home, to going out in public, ordering a coffee, dealing with people in shops, using public transport, and that's very anxiety provoking. And what makes us anxious, we will avoid. Very few golden rules in psychology, but I think that's one of them. If it makes us anxious, we're going to try to avoid that wherever possible. People will ruminate, so they will think, they'll turn over in their minds, and they will perseverate, they'll get fixed on those thoughts and the negative cognitions about the things they can't do. What does this mean for who I am? I'm no good anymore, and they will get stuck on those. As I've already mentioned, there will be avoidance of anxiety-provoking activities, including thinking about themselves and reflecting upon their challenges. There might be altered abilities for self-regulating the internal organisation of thoughts and feelings. This is particularly common with certain injuries to the frontal lobes, the frontal portions of the brain. And it can make people they can notice their arousal, their anxious arousal, it can go up. It can be very difficult to turn off. There are negative alterations to self-identity. And again, ruminations and quite obsessive thinking on their own altered ability, challenged ability, and their self-value. Over the course of time, of course, this can make people very pessimistic, and it can lower their mood. Not uncommon to see depression. Some of that, of course, is also underpinned by changes to the biology of the brain, but a lot of it is mediated and maintained by rather self-critical thinking, negative thinking about the self. And then, of course, there's frustration, irritability, changes in styles of judgment, relating, and preferences. So what I hope can be seen as fairly obvious from having looked at both PTSD and the typical effects of traumatic brain injury is that there's a giant overlap in how these people might present. They're going to be avoiding things. Both sets of people with PTSD and with brain injury, they're going to be avoiding things. They're going to be anxious. They're going to have increased reactivity, hypervigilance, threat awareness, pessimism, altered ways of thinking about themselves and others. And they're going to be thinking obsessively, again, underpinned by cognitive changes that come along with brain injury that make that kind of ruminative and obsessive thinking, getting fixed on thoughts, far more frequent. So there's a giant overlap in the presentation of PTSD and traumatic brain injury. And it makes you think, well, surely then there would be a giant comorbid diagnostic rate. We'd expect to see almost everybody with a traumatic brain injury very easily being diagnosed with PTSD. But of course, that is not the case. And historically, particularly through the 90s and even into the early 2000s, there was the prevailing view that in traumatic brain injury, PTSD was incredibly unlikely because people simply couldn't remember the traumatic event. And it was equivalent to not having witnessed the traumatic event. Now, I'm hoping that strikes everybody as contentious as it is. And I can imagine being a person with traumatic brain injury, suffering with very PTSD-like symptoms, hearing a doctor say that and thinking, blimey, they're saying that this trauma didn't happen to me, that my symptoms of PTSD and my fears now are actually about my brain injury. They're nothing to do with the trauma. They're actually my brain injury, and no one's going to treat me for PTSD. So I can imagine the frustration. Since that time, there has been a big shift in the research, the interest in the overlap of these two areas, and some very early attempts, and they are very early attempts, to try to unravel and better understand exactly what's going on here. When I was delving into the literature to find out exactly what is going on, what is current opinion here, it was very clear to me quite quickly that Bryant and Harvey are the big authors in this field. They seem to have done some of the big key studies, and they've been really driving the thinking around a lot of this issue. I would urge you to go and look them up, go and look their papers up, because they're quite brilliant, and they're also extremely well written. Now, in 1998, they presented a case study of a gentleman who had a severe brain injury. Moderate to severe was the diagnosis. And he had no memory of the road traffic accident that he'd been involved in. He had deep amnesia for that event, both long prior to the event and for a long time afterwards. And 12 months after his brain injury, while he's recovering and he's community-based, he starts to develop symptoms of PTSD when he was about to learn to drive a car. Again, he was going to get back on the road. And so Brian and Harvey tried to understand exactly how this could be possible. And they've forwarded a couple of possible explanations. It seemed that the intrusive memories that this gentleman was experiencing were all associated with a photograph of his accident that he'd been shown, and he'd seen the wreckage of the car on the road depicted in a photograph, and so he was having intrusions. His intrusions were actually reconstructed memories about what had happened, even though he had no memory for the actual event. But of course, he was there during the event, but had no memory of the actual event. Brian and Harvey suggest that fear conditioning is entirely feasible, and it makes perfect biological and psychological sense, in that in those moments during that traumatic incident, while you're still conscious, but also afterwards, that there is a massive fear response from the body. Huge amounts of adrenaline and noradrenaline in the brain, and that fear, and then the reconstructed memory of the photograph acting as the trigger, but also becoming a reconstructed memory, actually allowed this to present as a true post-traumatic stress disorder, even though the person had no significant memory of the event. Now, you can imagine this has prompted huge amounts of debate about the validity of these models, you know, the fear conditioning aspect of the model, the reconstructed memory, and it flies in the face of the thinking of the late 90s, early 2000s. But they write about it very well. They write about it very cogently. And for my thinking, it's worth giving a lot of credence to. Of course, there are the possibility of other neuropsychological factors. A person's ability to self-regulate their internal state, actually move away from difficult thoughts when they have them, as opposed to ruminate in a perseverative way. Very, very common with frontal lobe injuries, much more difficult for individuals. after brain injury. And so when it comes to making a decision, is this PTSD for this person who also has a brain injury, or is it not PTSD? We really have to make a very, very sensitive analysis, know that it's entirely feasible, but then look for the specificity. To what degree is this person's difficulties specifically related to trauma and the event which caused the injury? And what are the functional impacts of that cluster of specific trauma-related effects for the person? Not easy to disentangle, not easy to disentangle at all. It would take an extended assessment. It's a very important assessment to make because it points at your treatment direction and how you're actually going to address these difficulties for the person. And it also begs questions about what methods you're going to use to treat that. This is not just an issue of the individual. I know I've presented a case study here, Bryant and Harvey's case study, and of course that's always a single case, and it's very, very dodgy sometimes to try and extrapolate on the basis of a single case. But we are also finding in quite recent, very large cohort-based studies, not single case studies, like that of Van Praag et al. In 2019. And they found, again, very young research. They found a prevalence of 2.6% to 36% of people after TBI, traumatic brain injury, actually presenting with post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, that's a giant level of variation. You know, it's very easy to look at that and say, well, there's no scientific conclusion that can be drawn from that. And it is such young research, and there's still so much confusion around this, but it's starting to take off, and people are starting to think about this more in a more considered way, particularly after the work of Bryant and Harvey and the models that they've forwarded. Treatment, very, very difficult. The more difficult things are, you'll notice the briefer my slides are. Because it's actually far more difficult to be certain and thorough and pretend that there's lots and lots of stuff out there, because there just isn't. Generally speaking, it seems to me as a clinician that treatment for PTSD in traumatic brain injury would proceed along similar lines as I would use for post-traumatic stress disorder more broadly in non-brain injured people. A lot of what happens when we treat post-traumatic stress disorder is there's a period of skill development in those early stages. Skill development and also treating some of the negative cognitions that have developed about the world and about the self. And those aspects of identity, thinking about the person, making evaluations of the world and themselves, also the ability to relax and actually better self-regulate internal arousal, they would all be common to neuro rehabilitation as well as to post-traumatic stress disorder. So there's a very, very common ground there. Obviously, if it's PTSD focused, your eventual aim and goal, it will be slightly more trauma focused, as opposed to being more broadly focused in the case of traumatic brain injury without PTSD. But there's a huge common ground there. It would take longer. It would, that phase of treatment you'd have to expect it to take longer. And when I say longer, I don't mean the 3 weeks that you might give to that in 3 to 5 weeks that you might give to that in a non-brain injured person. It might become 3 to 5 months in somebody with a traumatic brain injury, because the acquisition of those skills is again part of neuro rehabilitation anyway, and valuable for that purpose alone. But learning those skills in an effective way, which would then allow the person to undertake more trauma-focused treatments, is going to take a long time, unless you're going to risk making that problem worse. So expect it to take longer. There has to be sensitivity to those issues of differential diagnosis. So we constantly you'd have to be teasing apart the what here is just traumatic brain injury, particularly problems with executive function, and what here is actually trauma focused, and being very mindful of the overlap, but also the differences between those two things. Far less contentious is the absolutely essential treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder in systems, families and relationships. As we'd have seen in the early slide, looking at the symptoms of PTSD, triggers are avoided. People develop negative evaluations of triggers. Sometimes the person with a brain injury is the trigger. This can affect relationships in very, very difficult ways, whether they be husband, wife, partner, or broader family. And these are the very same people that the brain injured person is relying upon for lots and lots of support, identity support, resolving those issues of identity and acceptance. So if there's a family member with PTSD, it's going to have a very marked negative impact upon the brain injured person, whether they have PTSD or not, on significant aspects of their neuro rehabilitation and them getting their lives back. So PTSD in members of family and the broader system have to be treated, and I don't see any contentiousness around that whatsoever. And I'm going to leave that there. And I've tried to keep it more brief than previous presentations when I can, because I can waffle for Britain. But if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask.
Paul, that was just so interesting. I mean, I've worked with clients for years and years, and often they have been diagnosed with PTSD, but just understanding it is absolutely fascinating. And I know you said to me it's a huge subject, and it is contentious. So while you were talking there, I was writing down questions that you may have answered. So I have a couple. Hang on. And I've got some really basic questions, like if somebody is not treated for PTSD for whatever reason, maybe it's not being picked up, maybe it's not being diagnosed. If they are not treated, is it something that stays with them, or can it wear off over time?
It can wear off over time. It depends on the severity of it. And particularly for someone with a brain injury, their ability to self-resolve that series of issues and find an eventual resolution is going to be very slow. And more likely to be incomplete because of the cognitive deficits and the difficulties with processing more broadly. So the answer is yes, it can self-resolve. In a person with traumatic brain injury, it might look like that's never going to happen, and is actually far less likely to happen in actuality. But I have actually heard of cases, read about cases of people with PTSD who do learn to self-manage that. Perhaps never completely, but certainly in a way that minimizes the functional impact and would probably protect them from a diagnosis, even though they remain distressed.
Okay, that's helpful. Now, often the clients that I've had, they will present with symptoms. You know, as you've said, avoidance, irritability, and various others. And for for the ordinary person and the ordinary family who is dealing with this, they may consider this is some other mood disorder, anxiety, depression, something like that. Now, I know that people have been to GPs and said, you know, these are the symptoms I'm having, and GPs may well diagnose anxiety or depression or something like that. If they do that and then they prescribe medication, whatever they prescribe, does that affect treatment then going forward once PTSD is diagnosed? Do you see what I mean?
If PTSD is diagnosed further down the line?
Yeah.
And is this for brain injured people you're thinking, or?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, actually, no, not just brain injury, but, you know, anybody actually.
PTSD more broadly. I think that one of the things, medication could be very, very useful, particularly if someone is experiencing arousal and disruption to their function in ways which it's, you know, perhaps the early stages of treatment, and those effects are so severe. Medication can be a fantastic help in those early stages. As things proceed, ideally, and this is ideally, often not the case in the real world, but you wouldn't want a person to be using a medication which helps them effectively avoid all anxious arousal, because that's going to inhibit their processing of those affective components of trauma-related memory, and probably adversely, negatively affect their treatment through psychological therapies, which is all about, you know, providing them with manageable exposure to those triggers and intrusions and helping them learn to process and deal with all of the associated effects of that. So if someone was taking, I remember speaking to a psychologist a while ago, and they were horrified that one of the people they were working with, the GP had prescribed them benzodiazepines to take it when they experienced or when they were going near triggers of any kind. So it improved their function. I think in that particular instance, they were able to use the tube. But their psychological therapy longer term was probably inhibited by that, because they were effectively chemically avoiding, a bit like substance misuse of other types. People with PTSD may drink heavily or use other substances to help avoid that distressing affect. I think the classic example that that comes to mind that we see in the press is service personnel returning from combat and developing substance misuse disorders, when in fact what we're looking at is a post-traumatic stress disorder, which is being self-managed chemically. And obviously over the long term, that chemical avoidance isn't healthy, and it doesn't help the person get better or come to terms with their symptoms and the underlying causes.
Got a question that's just come in regarding relaxation techniques for someone with PTSD and traumatic brain injury. What are some of the best ones you have found?
Right.
And how can we help someone who is struggling to process their trauma overcome the fear of confronting the trauma? So 2 questions there from one of our attendees.
Right. Okay. Both quite complicated questions.
I want to make it easy for you.
Fear of fear, and being very, very nervous about confronting those traumatic memories in a therapeutic context. Very, very typical for PTSD, both within and without traumatic brain injury. And that takes a long time to negotiate and to work through. And there's a whole variety of techniques and work that can be done around that. There's a whole lot of negative cognitions that come along with PTSD about coping. Sort of like, I don't want to have PTSD, but I won't cope with the therapy. And that's very, very typical and frequent. And you'll see lots of people attempting to engage with trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and they will disengage as soon as they get close to being exposed to those triggers and the intrusions and the aversive arousal that comes along with it, and they'll drop out of therapy. And you'll notice people go through several iterations, several attempts at engaging in that therapy until an eventual more successful engagement. The work that really seems to, and it depends on the individual circumstances, of course, but you have to work through those negative cognitions around coping. You also have to provide sufficient motivation for engagement by techniques from motivational interviewing, actually, by looking at the cost-benefit analysis of engaging. It's going to be unpleasant in moments. Our relationship is a comfortable and safe place for us to do that. Let's look at the benefits of overcoming this. You know, you might be able to drive your family to the zoo on Sunday. Well, you know, as long as you're not offering that on a Friday, you know, but eventually, you know, you're going to have better function, you're going to get your life back. So both sets of things there, and that's the early work of preparing someone for treatment for and exposure to those traumatic memories. In terms of managing the arousal, both within the therapeutic context and a skill for people to take away, you know, to help manage their anxiety, it depends on the situations in which they're experiencing that anxiety. And of course, whether they have a traumatic brain injury or not. And there's a whole, there's myriad techniques for helping people to better self-regulate. One of my favorites for brain injured people with pronounced arousal difficulties, particularly around post-traumatic stress disorder, is the dropping the anchor technique. That's a technique from acceptance and commitment therapy. And there's plenty of stuff about it online, and you can read about it in Hayes et al. I think first of all in their original book, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, which I think was around 2002, I think. But lots has been written about the dropping the anchor technique. It essentially asks people to re-engage with their body in a way which emphasizes the distance between themselves and their control of their body, their distress and their control of their body. So we remind them, we ground them in the present, in the room. We get them to press their feet into the floor, to hold their arms out, to move their arms. And this helps, you know, there's a lot of pain there inside, there's a lot of distress going on, but you still have control over your body. There's still things that you can do. You haven't lost control, you are coping. And this is a way of actually experiencing that in a very physically grounded way in that therapeutic context. And it's a very powerful technique. It's one of the ones I've used regularly.
Thanks, Paul. That was really a great question and a great answer. Thanks, Alice, for that question.
A good question. Yeah.
It was, wasn't it? Has anyone else got some questions for Paul?
I had a quick question. Just, I know you were talking about the neurological side, you know, and what it all could mean. When somebody gets a brain injury, is there a part of the brain that, or do you know of any patterns or coincidences of certain areas of the brain that are more likely to develop PTSD? Because I know you said, you know, I think 2/3 of women, but 1/3 of men get it. But is there a spot that if a certain area is damaged, that is more likely to bring on PTSD?
That's a really, it's a very good question, Gabby. It's a very, very tricky one. The neurobiology of PTSD it's a big field, and we know that certain areas of the brain, those areas of the brain involved in the processing of memories, for example, So the thalamus, the hippocampus, areas of the frontal lobe, and the areas of the brain responsible for fear responses, like the amygdala, again, one of the deeper brain structures. We know that they are all implicated, and they can be changed both chemically and structurally by long-term post-traumatic stress disorder. So in broad terms, yes, there are areas of the brain which are specifically related to fear and memory that are altered. When it comes to the differences between men and women, I know there's this idea of the gendered brain in some circles. It's not really borne out by too much hard science. You know, we have got very similar brains. Of course, the rest of the body that we have within which the brain sits is very, very different. You've got a whole series of hormones that I probably don't have. And yeah, and you know, so that aspect of you know, post-traumatic stress disorder and the neurobiology of PTSD, slightly more difficult to think about. However, one of the things I read fairly recently was that different types of trauma might be responsible for those sex differences in the difference in the prevalence rates of PTSD within men and women. Women are far more likely to experience interpersonal violence and sexual trauma than men. And there is some suggestion that it's those differences that actually account for the difference in prevalence rates, rather than something inherent about, you know, a woman's biology as opposed to a man's. And it's actually much more socio-cultural than biological. And that to me makes a big intuitive sense, to be honest. Yeah, but watch this space. You know, all of this research is just ongoing, and it strikes me as quite a young field, really, in terms of the research. You know, there's very little certainty out there.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Any other questions from anyone else? Nothing at the moment. If there is, after this session, if you do have anything, please do contact us. Thank you for all the lovely comments that are coming through. I think it's gone down very, very well, Paul. I think people are saying this has been absolutely brilliant, fantastic, and absolutely brilliant. So that's great. Thank you for those comments.
If anyone's got any more questions, I was just going to say, just drop me an email. I think everyone has access to mine. If not, I'll pop it on the chat, so I can get them over to Paul as well, and we can get the answers to you.
This is amazing. We've had this is amazing, Paul. So pretty good. And it is fascinating. And I know we talked about it before and said there's much more to have. There's more to say, isn't there? So maybe we'll revisit this later on.
Sure.
But thank you. It's been great. It's been so interesting, and I'm definitely going to book you again for another session on this.
I think we've had one more question come through. Which do people with brain injury get CPTSD or only PTSD?
CPTSD. You know, there's a very long presentation in CPTSD just on its own. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a very, very recent diagnostic category. It's not in the DSM-5. Which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual version 5, 2013, that came out. It's not in there. So it's quite a controversial diagnostic category. CPTSD is in the ICD-10, which is a diagnostic manual used far more prevalently east of Britain, so Europe and east of Britain. But it's not without some controversy, and so I wouldn't want to split PTSD and CPTSD. CPTSD, by its very nature, is about repeated incidents of trauma. And if that is the case, then you would have expected that to have at least partly occurred prior to the brain injury that occurred. So it's perfectly feasible, say, for a combat veteran to have repeated exposure to traumatic incidents. That would reach ICD-10 criteria for complex personality, post-traumatic stress disorder. Then that person might receive a brain injury. And so, of course, they would have a pre-existing CPTSD and a brain injury. So that's entirely feasible. But for a single incident, PTSD is the only real diagnosis that's available in either of those two diagnostic schemes. That's my understanding at the current time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think we're just about running out of time. Courtney says it makes sense. I was wondering about how you said domestic violence, if that could be why women's higher as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interpersonal violence of all types is more frequently experienced by women. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Okay.
Sorry, just to explain. The reason I asked about CPTSD was because when you said that women's prevalence was slightly higher in having PTSD with brain injury, I was wondering if that could also be a contributing factor, that it's been ongoing and then an event's occurred.
Yeah.
That's where it came from.
Yeah. Absolutely the case. Yeah. I know the example I used was combat veterans, but absolutely the same principles would apply if somebody had been exposed to repeated traumas within the home or within a relationship, and then had subsequently sustained a traumatic brain injury. Then yeah, absolutely the two could co-occur.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Courtney. I think we're going to finish there. If anyone has any more questions, please do contact us, or any comments. We'd be very grateful for your comments. As you know, we're always looking at new training sessions for our rehab assistants and our associates. So if you have any suggestions, we'd be extremely grateful, or any comments. Paul, thank you so much again.
No problem.
Really fascinating. I know we're going to revisit this. And plenty of other interesting subjects as well. So thank you for that. Thank you all for attending today, and for your positive comments. It means a great deal to us. If we can help you in any way with your rehab, with your clients, and provide you with the rehab assistance, please let us know. We cover all of the countries, so we're always interested to know how we can help you, and hopefully see you next time. Just a quick one, on the 28th of this month, we have got a pain specialist speaking, and the subject is insomnia and pain. So please look out for that, and hopefully we'll see you then. But thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you all again soon. Bye now.
Thank you.